I want to start by recognizing that the University of Washington is housed on the land of the Coast Salish peoples, land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We acknowledge those people and their ongoing history. This lecture today honors the work and life of our beloved colleague, Stephanie Camp. When Professor Camp passed away in 2014, she was the Donald W. Logan Endowed Chair in American History. She was a renowned scholar who authored the award-winning and much-taught book, Closer to Freedom, Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South, published in 2004. She also co-edited the important volume, New Studies in American Slavery, and several essays on the history of race and beauty. Stephanie was known for her grace, style, wit, and for her tremendous intellectual generosity as a teacher, mentor, and friend. Stephanie was also a beloved mother, sister, and daughter. We think of Stephanie so much in the springtime and her beautiful garden and the power she had to nurture and make things bloom. And as much as I wish we could have gathered in person to remember Stephanie, I really appreciate how this format on Zoom has allowed us to gather people from so many places. In particular, I want to acknowledge Stephanie's father, Professor Emeritus of Art, Donald Camp, and her mother, Marie Camp. I also want to acknowledge Stephanie's adored son, Luke Mariani, and his father, Mark. We're so honored to have them here with us. I want to thank all of those who contribute to the Stephanie M.H. Camp Memorial Fund and keep this annual lecture alive, as well as the Simpson Center for their support over the last 6 years. I also want to thank the UW Libraries for their co-sponsorship of the lecture this year. For their help in organizing this lecture, I want to thank colleagues Lynn Thomas, Glennis Young, Stephanie Smallwood, Chandan Reddy, and Josh Reed. And very special thanks to our fabulous staff, especially Alexandra Colley du Sablon, who has handled all of the organizational and technical aspects of this high-tech event. If you have questions during or after the talk, you can put them in the chat if you would, and Alexandra will compile them. I'm now going to turn things over to my colleague, Professor Stephanie Smallwood, who teaches here at UW on race, slavery, and the Atlantic world. Professor Smallwood will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jordana. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce Tiya Miles, our distinguished speaker for today. As a fellow Ohioan myself, I'm happy to start by noting that Tiya was born and raised in Cincinnati, a part of the state of Ohio that is at once both Midwestern and distinctly Southern. And I can't help but wonder whether those origins laid a foundation for Tiya's scholarship that spans multiple and overlapping sites of Black and Indian histories in the United States. Tiya received her undergraduate degree in Afro-American Studies from Harvard University. She completed an MA in Women's Studies at Emory University and then returned to the Midwest to earn her PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota, where she was mentored by the great David Roediger. She began her professional career at the University of Michigan, where she remained until recently joining the faculty of Harvard University, where she is appointed as Professor of History and as Radcliffe Alumnae Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Tiya has produced a prolific body of work that reveals the deep intersections of African American and Native American histories and reveals the intricate details of Black and Indian women's lives. Her first two books, Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom, published in 2005, and The House on Diamond Hill, a Cherokee Plantation Story, published in 2010, are foundational and brave works that have helped us confront and reckon with the ways both slavery and kinship entangle African American and Native American histories. Both books won numerous prizes, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians, the Laura Romero Prize from the American Studies Association, and awards from the National Council on Public History and the American Society for Ethnohistory. Tiya was a member of the 2011 class of MacArthur Fellows, which makes her a genius and the colloquial parlance associated with that honor. And since then, she has produced 4 books. In 2015, she gifted us with the full poetic quality and power of her prose craft and imagination with The Cherokee Rose, a novel of gardens and ghosts, which was a Lambda Literary Award finalist. The Dawn of Detroit, a chronicle of slavery and freedom in the city of the Straits, published in 2017, transformed our understanding of slavery's geographic reach and won the Organization of American Historians Merle Curdy Prize, in addition to being co-winner of both the Frederick Douglass Book Prize and the American Historical Association's James Rowley Prize, among other distinctions. Also in 2017, Tiya published a series of public lectures under the title Tales from the Haunted South, Dark Tourism, and Memories of Slavery from the Civil War Era. And finally, Tiya's most recent book is the one she will present from today, entitled All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, due out next month with Random House. If you were able to keep track of that, that's 6 books in 16 years, and I won't even try to touch on edited volumes, essays, and articles because I need to hurry up and finish this introduction. Among the many statements praising Tiya's gifts as a historian on the back cover of her forthcoming book, this one really stood out to me. Imani Perry writes that, quote, Tiya Miles is a gentle genius. The histories she writes are deeply feeling as they are brilliantly researched, and her writing is both elegant and tender, end quote. I think Imani Perry perfectly captures the unique combination of qualities that mark all of Tiya's beautiful body of work. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to linger in the force of your research and writing today, Tiya. So thank you for helping us honor our beloved colleague by sharing your latest work with us today. Welcome.
Stephanie, that was so moving. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. What you have said just now and your quoting of Imani Perry's words about my book brings to mind Stephanie Camp and all the ways in which we really do this work together. We put our thoughts together, we lend our voices, and then we create something incredible as a collective. I am so honored to be here. I feel very moved to be here with all of you, with members of Stephanie Camp's family, with members of the history department at the University of Washington, with last year's camp lecturer, Professor Charleston, with so many colleagues and so many people who care about these important issues. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Jordana Balkin and also Alexandra, who helped with an important technical challenge earlier on today. I'm grateful for that. And I also want to say something that I know is obvious to everyone who was here, and that is Stephanie Camp's ideas, her brilliance, her legacy is ongoing and will last as long as this good earth lasts for us, as long as we take care of this planet that we call dear. I've been struck at the way in which it seems that no matter what topic I turn to in my books, in the books that I'm working on, I need to reference Closer to Freedom. I always have to have that book by my side. It doesn't matter what I'm working on. So I was doing a history of a Cherokee plantation some years ago, and I turned to Stephanie Camp's work and drew out that wonderful idea that we all know so well that she uses so beautifully of rival geographies. And I just want to show you this because of course we all have this book and we all marked it up like I have, but this page is like my love note to Stephanie Camp, because you see it's my heart post-it, which I don't use very often. I save my heart post-its for the most special of pages. And this is a page where she talks about the idea and begins to apply the idea that really opened the door for how I could think about this Cherokee plantation history that I worked on some years ago. And for the book that's going to be coming out very shortly, early in the month, as Dr. Smallwood said, I have had to turn to Closer to Freedom again to bring out my dog-eared copy and to see what Stephanie Camp had to say about this topic of enslaved women and their embodied experiences and their creativity, because she is the first one who so eloquently and so patiently and with such care opened up this world of Black women's ingenious uses of what they had available to them, including time of day, some material objects, but also time of day, season of year, to be able to enact their various forms of resistance. And so many of you will hear Stephanie Camp's work through much of what it is that I'm going to share today. She's present in many of my footnotes, and you will see that there's nothing new under the sun, and much of what I am doing in this work is drawing from the work of Dr. Camp and many other talented, especially Black women scholars who have studied slavery. So what I'd like to do with our time this evening is to offer an overview of all that she carried, which is my forthcoming book, and offer a sense of how I came to work on this project and what it's about. And then I want to move into a more focused look on one particular chapter. So I'm going to share my screen now and show some slides and some images as I talk about the book. So this book, All That She Carried, is not a book that I expected to write. I think many of us have this experience. We sort of have a plan and a trajectory, and something pushes us off of that track. Oftentimes that something can be very special and very important. I had expected to write my next book on African-American women in the US West. And it just so happened that this topic, which focuses on the item that you see on your screen, a sack, seemed to just fall into my lap. But of course, things don't happen that way, right? People share ideas, people make connections, and that's what happened in this case. I was at a conference in Savannah, Georgia. The conference was focused on environmental history in the coastal Southeast. And I had just given a talk that was describing the slave rebellion on Dunbar Creek, which is on St. Simon Island in Georgia, in the Golden Isles of Georgia. And this so-called slave rebellion was a moment when many Igbo people who were being brought into Georgia through this deep water channel of Dunbar Creek decided that they would rather take their chances with another sphere of life, or maybe death, than to be enslaved. And they capsized the ship, and many of them fell into the deep waters. And this is where the beauty of folklore comes in, because these are the people who were said to have flown back to Africa. The people of Dunbar Creek at this moment. So I gave this talk about Dunbar Creek, and I read some of the voices of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, their descendants. He remembered the story of flying back to Africa, of their ancestors flying back to Africa. And I talked about how some people today who live in that area claim that Dunbar Creek is haunted, that they can hear the voices of people who made that dramatic leap there back in the 1830s. And after this talk, somebody I didn't know, a local journalist, came up to me and said, "Do you know Ashley Sack?" I did not know what Ashley Sack was at the time. And it turns out that Ashley Sack had been discussed in that local area in Savannah very recently because a curator at a museum where it was being housed had come given a talk on it. And after that encounter with the journalist, I went back to my hotel room and I saw that he had sent me an email encouraging me once again to find out what Ashley Sack was. So I did find out, and encountering the object completely changed what it was that I would do next. So this is the back of Ashley Sack, which is an antique seed or flour sack that was manufactured in the middle 1800s. And it seems that it is not particularly interesting on the face of it. Unless, that is, you have read Heather Williams' discussion of this item, where she talks about enslaved people having been separated. But on the face of it, this seems like a straightforward object that wouldn't have very much to tell us. I want to read you a description of the item from the first museum catalog that was written about it in the early 2000s. Charleston, South Carolina, circa 1850 sack, in 1921 needlework. Plain weave cotton ground, cotton lock stitch fabrication, 3-strand cotton embroidery floss, back stitch embroidery. Height 29, 11, 16, width 15 and 3/4 inches. Sacks made of plain weave cotton, like this example, were manufactured for flour seeds and other food staples, beginning in the late 1840s with the invention of the industrial sewing machine. But once this sack is turned over, we see this. We see a very different side of what might have seemed to have been a utilitarian object, a simple, plain object. And what this says is, my great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her, it be filled with my love, always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. Until late March of this year, the sack was on exhibit at the Smithsonian. Many of you perhaps saw it then. And now it is at Middleton Place Plantation, right outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Middleton Place Foundation is the owner of the sack, and they had lent it out to the National Museum of African American History and Culture for its opening and for the last several years. The Middleton Place Plantation just brought the sack back to its grounds. So the sack has moved from place to place, but Even more compelling, I think, than the movement of this object is the story that it tells about Black women's experience and craft work, about the Black family, about heirlooms, and the things that Black families have saved, such as the braids that you see here in a family Bible that was shared with me by a graduate student in the past, and about love. I think I want to pause to say something about love right now that I didn't expect to say, but this feels like the right context because of the nature of this lecture. When I first started working on this project, I really tried to run away from that big word love in the middle of the SAC, in the middle of the transcript that I just showed you. And I think I did that because I felt that it wasn't rigorous enough. I felt that it was maybe too obvious. I felt that I needed to ask deeper questions and to more sharply scrutinize the SAC and to focus on love. But now, after around 4 years, going on 5 years of thinking about the SAC and writing about it, I have come to the conclusion that it is best to accept what the women who packed the SAC, passed it on, and saved it are telling us. And I think they're telling us that love is central and essential, and that love can be conveyed through cherished objects that are passed down, such as this Bible, these pages, and these locks of hair. So we know that mothers and daughters and other family members often exchange keepsakes, items that they cherish from previous generations, and things that they love from family members whom they have lost. And it's common for people to pass down things that are personally meaningful and that they think may have a certain kind of value or different kinds of values. But a woman named Rose, a Black mother with little control over her own life, with no financial assets, passed on an object of invaluable worth. Rose was unfree, an enslaved woman in Charleston in the 1850s, when her only recorded child was about to be taken away from her. In that moment of grave threat that we can scarcely imagine today, Rose had the presence of mind to grab the sack. And then she started to pack it. The sack wasn't for Rose, but rather for her daughter, Ashley, a girl of only 9 years old. Thinking suddenly and on her feet with creativity and brilliance, Rose made a judgment call. I think she might have been thinking, what was required? What did she have that could help keep this single small girl alive? And then she packed the things that answered that question that she had at her disposal. They were a dress, a braid, pecans, and a mother's love. In the book, I take these objects that were in the sack and the sack itself as points of departure for thinking about many things, and at the center, Black women's experiences. And I'll just offer a few notes here about each item, just a very few minutes before I move on and talk more about dress. So the braid that Rose cut from her own hair could function like a memento and even like a family photograph. And I owe that idea to my colleague, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. The braid could be a visual and tactile representation of the mother, but also symbolize a longer familial lineage. And pecans were a luxury good at the time in the coastal Southeast, and they were and are highly nutritious. So they could have functioned as a trade good and also as an energy source for Ashley. And of course, love was the biggest and boldest thing that this mother had to give. And there's so many meanings and applications of love. Love could be an alleviator of suffering. It could remind Ashley that she wasn't alone. It could remind her that she had kin. It could swaddle her in the kind of care that she would most dearly miss. And so Rose gave Ashley this packed sack on the eve of their separation, and Ashley passed it down to her granddaughter, Ruth Middleton. Ruth, who was a free woman who moved to Philadelphia during the Great Migration, embroidered the sack and the story and saved both for history, sealing with thread a Black mother's eternal love. The embroidered story of loss on the sack, which is so common in the history of American slavery, is breathtakingly particular to this mother and father. And their specific story tells us not only that Black women survived the atrocity of captivity, but also how they did it. The story gives us an example and a model of how they did it. Through identifying the needs of kin and generously providing those essential things: food, clothing, shelter, identity through lineage, and most certainly an affirmation of worthiness. So this is the kind of thing, object, material, artifact that Rose was up against. This is the home in Charleston of the couple that were most likely to have owned Rose and Ashley. I don't know this for certain, but this is the best conclusion that I have arrived at, and also that Mark Auslander has arrived at. And he's an anthropologist who did the background work of trying to track down the sack before I came to this project. Through separate research trails, we arrived at the same place, this house. So this is what Rose was up against. And what moves me so much is she was willing to stand against all that with her sack, with her seed sack or flour sack, with her tattered dress. And I find in this example and in the material culture of African America a source of inspiration and even a theoretical exemplar of the ways that we might think about our national and global predicament today. We face the kinds of threats that are massive, that we can't quite get our thoughts around, that are so complex. And that's what Rose faced. And she faced a massive threat. She faced a system that was all-encompassing. And she stood a very little chance of being able to save her daughter in the face of all that. But nevertheless, she tried. She tried by looking at the materials that she had access to and what was around her. And she found a way to resist. One of those ways that Stephanie Camp's work so potently shows us. Through material culture, connected with creativity, connected with emotion. So I think this sack represents and shows us that Rose had the hope for her daughter's survival, and she had a vision for her daughter's survival. And we know that Ashley persevered because she kept this sack and she passed it down. And so did her daughter, Rosa. And so did Rosa's daughter, Ruth. And so I think of this project as an odyssey and also an example, a model, an exemplar of the tools, the technologies, the approaches that we might be able to think about applying today as we face great odds. Because Rose didn't have very much. She didn't even have her freedom. She took an action which probably to her felt quite small, and probably to many scholars would have seemed quite small. And yet through that action, surely, she helped this line of women in her family to carry on. So that's the kind of exploration that I work on in the book. And these are the kinds of things that I'm trying to work through in the book. This is the kind of spirit that I try to put at the center of the book. A spirit that really does embrace that word love and that embraces the notions of hope and resilience, even in the face of an onslaught of corruption, even in the face of deep trauma, even in the face of wrongs that can never fully be paid for. So I feel that I've gone on quite a bit in offering that frame for the book and then setting the stage for what I want to talk about in particular today, which is the tattered dress. So as we continue to talk this evening, I'm going to keep my eye on the time, and you may see that I'm cutting a little bit as I move along. So what I'm going to be reading from now is a draft chapter of the dress portion of the book. And this is the section of the book where I really leaned into Stephanie Kemp's work and where I grabbed Closer to Freedom off the shelf again and started putting in new notes and rereading things and saying, oh, right, yeah, oh, I forgot about the vines, which is an amazing comment that she makes, an amazing insight that she has about the ways in which Black women are using nature to embellish their clothing, to personalize their clothing, and to express their creativity. So this is the section in the book where I do the most with that, and I wanted to share portions of it with you. A tattered dress comes first in Rosa's list, as embroidered by her great-granddaughter, Ruth Middleton. This placement should give the object primacy in our consideration of the sack, as it suggests that the dress was the first thing packed, or the first thing recalled, or the main thing emphasized in this family's saga. The list and its order hint at something personal about Ruth, the sewer, who became known for her stylish attire in 1940s Philadelphia. This was actually one really incredible and kind of jubilant aspect of the project, was reading descriptions of Ruth Middleton in the Philadelphia Black press in the 1940s, because wow, was she a dresser. I mean, people in her community were often describing her outfits, and to recognize that in connection with this dress that Rose saved was just very eye-opening for me about the connections across generations and about the different forms that creativity can take across the generations. Whether or not Rose packed the dress first or third, it is clear from the list that Rose thought immediately about how to clothe Ashley. In doing so, she could cover the nakedness of her child's vulnerable outer body, while at the same time signaling the girl's precious inner worth. Rose knew, as did many women ensnared by slavery, that apparel is material in nature, but also social in essence. By providing Ashley with a dress, worn and frayed as it may have been, Rose insisted on Ashley's right to bodily protection and feminine dignity, even as she emphasized the tie of love threading eternally between them. A tattered dress was 1,000 things to Rose and her sisters in enslavement: protection, honor, artistry, memory, and also connection. In our hands and imaginations, a garment like this might index whole social relational worlds for women who were enslaved. Enslavers and the enslaved were each fluent in what we might call the language of dress. Theirs was a relationship based on power differentials, and visible distinctions emphasized that line of difference. The categorization of Blacks as a race fit for slavery, and also of Native Americans in the 18th century, already relied on the shorthand of visual cues. It was easier to set aside a class of people as inferiors if they shared easily identifiable characteristics: the skin color, hair texture, and facial features that became the building blocks of race. Fabric, an additional layer on top of these bodily features, signified who owned others or who could be owned. Slaveholders sought to materialize and dramatize the debasement of enslavement, covering the brown-skinned bodies already selected and bred for this purpose in coarse fabrics dyed in drab colors and marked by simple prints. Enslavers also attempted to dictate what fabrics and styles their workers could wear in order to highlight low status. In some cases, Southern states wrote clothing differentiation into the law itself. South Carolina legislators passed the colony's initial slave law, an act for the better ordering of slaves, in 1690. And here they stipulated first and foremost that, quote, in His Majesty's plantations in America, slavery has been introduced and allowed, and the people commonly called Negroes, Indians, mulattoes, and mestizos have been deemed absolute slaves. That's the end of the quote. And Section 26 of the law stipulated the boundaries of permissible dress for the people that were listed. Quote, whereas many of the slaves in this province wear clothes much above the condition of slaves, for the procuring whereof they use sinister and evil methods, no owner or proprietor of any Negro slave or slave whatsoever, except livery men or boys, shall permit or suffer such Negro or other slave to have or wear any sort of apparel whatsoever, finer, other, or of greater value than Negro cloth, daffelds, coarse kerseys, osnabrigs, blue linen, check linen, or coarse garlics or calicos, checked cottons or Scotch plaids, garlics or calico, under the plain of forfeiting all and every such apparel and garment that any person shall commit his Negro or other slave to have or wear. So here we see a very close attention to the precise kinds of fabrics that enslaved people should be allowed to wear, because the elite in South Carolina, enslavers in South Carolina, recognized that clothing was deeply political and that social allowances could be indexed by way of clothing. Now, Black captives recognized the very same thing, which is why they were trying to acquire garments above their station that had to be outlawed by the South Carolina legislature. On the streets of Charleston and also other southeastern cities such as Savannah, enslaved women in particular were viewed as dressing too well. And there are a number of accounts of this written by visitors from New England, visitors from England, in which the writers talk about their surprise and even their disgust in seeing Black women dressed in nice fabrics and dressed in attractive styles. In the book, I collect many of these examples, but I'm going to pass by them now. I want to talk a little bit about the special kinds of fabric that were listed in the law, which we see in use in many places across the South. These are various kinds of fabrics that are collected under the name of Negro cloth. And Negro cloth was not a specific weave of textile. It was instead any kind of fabric that included a set of negative characteristics: cheapness, coarseness, dullness. Characteristics meant to publicly identify and demean the wearer. New England textile manufacturers began to produce fabrics that were branded as Negro cloth. And this Negro cloth produced a counterintuitive doubling effect, making those who were forced to wear it highly visible in society as abject inferiors, and at the same time invisible as social actors of any consequence. A white person, who was traveling through any of these locations that we've been discussing, Charleston, Savannah, the plantations in the rural areas, would or should, it was hoped, be able to recognize who was who based on their clothing. In addition to being made of rough cloth,
Tiya, it looks like you're with us. Can you see us?
I'm back. My internet just went down, everyone.
Oh no.
Oh, how terrible. I'm so sorry to sit there for however many minutes.
We're so
So
glad we got you back. I'm
well,
going to mute myself.
Okay, I'm glad that I'm back too. I apologize for that, and I hope that I can manage to stay online here. I think what I'm going to do is just not screen share for a while and see if that helps with the bandwidth of my household. Okay, so I was just outlining Negro cloth, the ways in which it was used, and the ways in which the fabric, the style, the fit of so-called slave clothing was meant to demean enslaved people, was meant to subjugate them, and was meant to maintain those lines of difference between enslavers and enslaved. And now what I'm going to hope to do, if I can stay online with you, is to just really shift and jump over some of the material that I had planned to share about that part of this topic, and look instead at the reactions of enslaved people to this so-called Negro cloth, to these kinds of fabrics that they were being forced to wear. Enslaved people were keenly aware of this grab bag of psychological tricks, of clothing meant to demean the wearer and gifts intended to extort labor as well as to ensure loyalty. The fortunate few who escaped slavery and wrote autobiographies of life behind the Southern lines often reflected on their hatred of dress and the social work it performed under slavery. These writers knew exactly what was at stake, that clothing for enslaved people was a uniform of inferiority, a method for simultaneously enforcing bodily deprivation and social degradation. As Harriet Jacobs angrily recalled about her, quote, scanty wardrobe, end quote, as a preteen, quote, I have a vivid recollection of the linsey-woolsey dress given me every winter by Mrs. Flint. How I hated it. It was one of the badges of slavery. Elizabeth Keckley remembered that when she was called upon at the age of 4 to tend her mistress's baby, she was relocated to the main house from the, quote, rude cabin where her mother resided. And her wardrobe improved to, quote, simple attire that was a short dress and a little white apron. Narrating this duty and what she wore while carrying it out surfaced a memory of Keckley's first lashing, a severe beating suffered for not knowing how to properly pick up the infant. Enslaved children, Keckley learned at a tender age, were trained in their work by means of punishment and insult. Her uniform set her apart as a person, a child of 4, worthy of such abuse. Louisa Piquet also knew slave dress and harsh treatment intimately. Born near Columbia, South Carolina, to a 15-year-old enslaved girl herself named Elizabeth and their owner, John Randolph, Louisa was soon relocated. Randolph sold the enslaved mother and daughter because Louisa looked too much like another infant in the household, the half-sibling born to Randolph and his wife. The baby Louisa's pale skin color and straight hair was a sign of sexual indiscretion that haunted numerous slaveholding families, especially the white mistresses within them, and prompted harsh expulsions such as this one. Under a new regime of control in Mobile, Alabama, Louisa's mother suffered exploitation by their second owner, Mr. Cook, who serially impregnated her. This owner then set his sights on the teenage Louisa. After gaining her freedom and moving to Cincinnati decades later, after her third owner had died, Louisa painfully recalled that her assigned dress in slavery was, quote, very thin and low-necked. She recalls a very painful and difficult moment in her teenage years when her owner gained access to her body, partly because, as she says in her narrative, quote, I was dressed so thin. This thinness of enslaved women's clothing, the grossly inadequate coverage that violated societal norms for their gender, is another feature that set their apparel apart, not just as Black people, but also and especially as women. Enslaved Black women could not hope to approximate white standards of propriety. These were the privileges instead of another group of women. Scant dress, as well as hard labor in hot environments that necessitated the hiking up of skirts, as Deborah Gray White has shown, were conditions of their forced servitude that led to grossly unfair charges of immodesty and hypersexuality. Enslaved women, as well as men, commented on their poor quality of raiment, and they found the clothing forced upon them insulting to their dignity. And here in this section, I have a number of quotations about that, but I'm going to move past that in the interest of time. So this is another section in the chapter. The Proxy War of Dress was not one-sided. Enslaved people fought back on plantations and farms, as well as in cosmopolitan cities, by wearing clothing that defied their assigned lowly station. They sabotaged attempts at sartorial control by their owners as well as lawmakers. Black men and women often dreamed of acquiring new clothing and footwear. Soft clothes and well-fitting shoes that swaddled and honored their bodies challenged the notion that they were a lowly subset of the species, deserving to be dressed only in rags and sacks. When enslaved people had adequate means, money acquired through hiring themselves out or stealing things from those who had stolen their persons, they often set their sights on cloth and apparel that signaled their essential worth. Ledger books from stores operated on plantations indicate how enslaved people spent scarce funds. Enslavers housed these stores on their premises because they realized unfree people sought material pleasures and wanted to capture this population's meager income while discouraging attempts to acquire things from afar. Unfree people whose spending has been traced in plantation store records across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, spent most of their rarely obtained dollars on cloth, clothing, sewing supplies, and handkerchiefs, which made up 64.6% of their purchases across 6 surviving account books. Black women took these bolts of hard-won cloth and transformed them into masterpieces of cut and color that earned them back an ability to signify their sense of self-worth and community value through dress. By hook or by crook, theft, trade, and sometimes purchase, enslaved women acquired colorful fabric and fanciful trimmings. And here you all will hear echoes of Dr. Camp. They sacrificed nights, time most often set aside for familial caretaking, cabin maintenance, and extra work that might have earned money, to engage in the labor of producing clothing for themselves. They created striking outfits with specially procured cloth and homespun that they wove. One man, formerly enslaved in North Carolina, described the harsh treatment of his mother, quote, whose mistress did not provide her with clothes, end quote. Determined to create her own wardrobe, his mother acquired a wheel with the help of her husband and spun, quote, in the night in her cabin. The mistress, seeking to commandeer all of the woman's hard work, confined her to the plantation spinning house 12 hours a day. In response, the son recalled that his mother would, quote, then go home and fixing her wheel in a place made in the floor to prevent its making a noise, she would spin for herself in order that she might be decently clad, end quote. To a degree of self-motivated work that is difficult to conceive of, Black women fashioned their wardrobes, expressed creative imagination, ornamentation, and personal style. They risked punishment to wear these self-designed dresses at religious and social gatherings with their families and community members on Sundays, and at secret evening reveries that took place in woods. Procuring natural items to finish and embellish their clothing, enslaved women used vines and tree limbs to replicate the full-bodied look of the iconic Southern hoop skirt that symbolized femininity and luxurious excess in the 1850s and 1860s. Notably, the hoop also created, quote, protected space around the wearer, a symbolic shield for their bodies that Black women would surely have cherished. Black women also fought the daily battles for their dignity, as expressed through dress in more dramatic ways. A few were bold enough to tear the clothing right off their mistresses' bodies, acting on resentment as well as self-defense. A girl enslaved in Tennessee, nicknamed Puss by her mother, who was Fanny, watched her mistress hit Fanny with a stick for unknown reasons. In the absence of the patriarch of the household, Puss says, quote, Ma struck back and a fight followed. The thought seemed to race into my mother's mind to tear mistress's clothing off her body. She caught, pulled, ripped, and tore. Poor mistress was nearly naked when the storekeeper got to them and pulled Ma off, end quote. When the patriarch, the owner of Puss and Fanny, returned, he promised to have Fanny, quote, whipped by law. The mistress proclaimed that Fanny would be knocked down, quote, like a beef. Fanny was then hired out as punishment after this incident, separated from her daughter, Puss. But Fanny returned a year later, wearing, Puss said, quote, new clothes and a pair of beautiful earrings, unquote. A vision of triumph, I would suggest, that was made real to her daughter through the symbol of dress. So Puss, quote, decided to follow her mother's example. I intended to fight, she said. And if I couldn't fight, I'd kick. And if I couldn't kick, I'd bite. Black women later took advantage of the disruption of the Civil War to rifle through plantation chests and put on the dresses of their mistresses, wanting to give their exhilaration the shape of their own form, Stephanie Camp writes. And after the war, the notion of freedom included the right to be properly clothed. Elizabeth Keckley recounts an example of this desire to wear respectable clothes in association with a free life. Soon after the war ended, Keckley encountered a woman on the street who had migrated from her plantation to Washington, D.C. Bent at the spine with old age, the woman confided to Keckley that she had hoped to receive a shift dress from Mrs. Lincoln while there in the nation's capital. While Keckley interpreted this expectation as a remnant of slavery in which the master or mistress distributed annual clothing rations, and Keckley may have been right here. The hoped-for garment might also have represented a bid for respectability and for the protection of modesty that the speaker believed should come with freedom. We have spoken here of many dresses, not as many as I had hoped, given our technical difficulty. But Rose, as we know, had only one dress to give. The garment she passed along to her daughter was in a poor condition. It was tattered, and we can imagine faded and stained. The dress was most likely made of coarse cotton or the linen woolen blend characteristic of so-called Negro cloth. If Rose had found favor with her owners, perhaps she had access to, quote, gay fabric, something brightly colored in calico, or even a higher grade of cloth intended for white women's wardrobes. If hired out by her owners and permitted to retain a fraction of her income, Rose may have gathered means and opportunity to purchase a fabric she favored, and then to transform it into a personalized garment. Perhaps there was a story interwoven into that cloth that only Rose knew of, or that Rose may have whispered to Ashley. It is a guess more than fair, given the proficiency of enslaved women with the needle, that Rose sewed this dress for herself, perhaps years before that winter when she was separated from her daughter. Perhaps Rose had worn it over time, imparting to it her signature scent that her child might recognize over weeks, months, and even years. A brick kitchen, holding it until the moment was right. From what we know of enslaved women's stories, a special item of apparel was never acquired without sacrifice. And the clothing that Rose bestowed on Ashley was likely hard-won. A tattered dress is 1,000 things. This is something that a friend of mine who sews said to me when I told her about Rose having packed a dress for Ashley. A tattered dress is 1,000 things. We've only spoken of a particular one. And this one dress, belonging first to Rose and then to Ashley, was a fabric scar, a second skin, a coat of armor. And it was also tactile proof of lives that could be split by slavery, but would always remain interwoven. Thanks, you all. I really appreciate your attention, and especially through that internet lapse.
Thank you so much, Professor Miles, for this wonderful talk, and thanks for your perseverance through a challenging technical situation. Our apologies about that, and we're glad to have you back. I know that it's getting late on the East Coast, but I hope we have time for just a few questions. If you have questions in the audience that you'd like to put in the chat, we can deliver those to Professor Miles. I have a question from Purnima Dhawan, my colleague, says that she notices some of the very careful darning on Ashley's sack and wondered if you could say a little bit more about the care of preserving and saving the textiles that you've seen.
Yes, the darning is incredible. And what if I can, I don't think I can officially bring it up again, but you can see the ways in which there are little patches sewn into the fabric, and they are in shapes. They're in shapes of a square, maybe a circle or a half circle, maybe something that kind of looks like a triangle. It is really, I think, impossible to know who exactly made those patches, because the sack, passed through many years and many hands. But it does seem to be the case that whoever made those alterations, whoever mended the sack, was in the family, because the sack was in the family all the way up until probably the mid 1900s. And that's when the last person that we know of from this line of women died, Dorothy Middleton. And Mark Auslander, whose work I mentioned earlier, has surmised that because Dorothy Middleton died in a home that was not very well resourced, that it's possible that her items ended up being scattered or perhaps being sold for funds. And so the sack didn't turn up again, as far as we members of the public really know, until the early 2000s, around 2007, when somebody found it in a flea market rag bin. So while it's possible that somebody along the way, a flea market shopper, made, not the one we know of, but someone previously made the patches, it was probably the family. As far as its care within the museum space, that I cannot speak to. I do know that it has been exhibited in public spaces, but behind protective material. And the other thing that I know about that, which is not really about care, but it's about study, is that it has not been, well, I suppose it's about care and study, the intersection. It has not been subjected to any kind of chemical testing or DNA testing, which I think is very interesting. I mean, that might be, and probably to a good extent is, a matter of resources or a matter of expediency. But it might also be curators thinking about what these women might have wanted to see happen to their fabric. The question of whether or not some kind of chemical process would feel like a violation of the fabric.
Thank you. We have a question on going on a different topic about the way that this example unearths a kind of different narrative of enslaved women as nurturing mothers. This is a question from Marlon Thomas, and thinking about how there's a whole literature on how enslaved women didn't have the opportunity to act as nurturing mothers. So what does this example tell us about a kind of new framework for Black women and mothering?
I appreciate that question so much as well. This was a difficult line for me to navigate in the project, actually, because we have mountains of evidence, and this story is also another piece of evidence that Black mothers were deprived of their ability to mother in sustained ways, their ability to mother perhaps in the ways that they most wanted to, in the ways that they imagined. That was really at the heart of what slavery did and what it was about. I love Saidiya Hartman's concept and phrase, lose your mother, because I think it encapsulates that notion so poignantly and succinctly, that the slave trade, and I would argue enslavement in the US as well, the domestic slave trade, really turned around the loss of the mother and the reverse of that, the loss of the child. And so I worried in working on this project about wanting to turn so fully toward a story of hope and resilience and a mother who managed to maintain a tie, even if it was an emotional tie or a tie through story, at the expense of recognizing that the system of enslavement never intended for Rose to Mother Ashley, never intended for this family memory and family lineage to be carried on. So the perseverance of the lineage stands against what slavery was about. I was also concerned that I might lean too far into wanting to show all the ways in which Black enslaved mothers took care of daughters, took care of children, attempted to rescue children, and they did. They went to so many great lengths, as many scholars have also shown, to protect and defend their children, girls and boys. And I am sure children who may have been in the interstitial spaces of gender, but who we may not know about quite yet in the records. So mothers did this, and I wanted to lift these stories up at the same time that I found myself facing a challenge and a problem in the work, which was that I had a draft where the only examples I was giving of enslaved Black mothers and their relationships with children, their actions with regard to children, were positive examples, examples of rescue, examples of people who had somehow made it, somehow survived. Their love had survived, evidence of their love had survived. And I knew and I felt that in the work, I had to kind of also correct for that, because motherhood is such a complicated experience. It is such a diverse kind of history. I think that's the case for all mothers, for anybody who does mother in any way, shape, or form, not just biological mothering, of course. And there were Black mothers whose actions, based on the evidence that we have about them, which of course is going to be slanted, biased, narrow, but there were mothers whose actions more closely fit kind of the narrative that we know that the questioner laid out. The storyline we're familiar with, even the negative stereotypes of Black mothers that persist to this day. And I felt that I had to not find examples, but rather stop overlooking examples of the many Black mothers in my primary sources who were also doing things like not wanting to mother, who were refusing to take care of their children, who their children later remembered as being verbally or physically abusive. There's one story that I end up relating in the book where a daughter talks about how her mother beat her and would say and enact this punishing ritual in the way that her owners had beat her. So the mother would kind of reenact what her owners had done to her on the body of her own daughter. So these things are real, these traumas are real. And I think that we do have to look head on at the ways in which abuse could happen, did happen within Black families. The ways in which Black mothers have chosen to mother in all kinds of ways, including electing not to mother. At the same time that I think we do need correctives to stereotypes that tell us that Black mothers could not mother or were incompetent mothers.
Well, maybe we'll keep talking about love then and all its complexities. We have another question from Frances O'Shaughnessy, who is a graduate student in the history department. And Frances says that they particularly appreciated your discussion around love, as it reminded them of a quote from Robin Kelly, who's one of our previous speakers in this lecture series, which Frances paraphrases as, "Love and freedom are some of the most revolutionary ideas available to us, and yet we as intellectuals fail to grapple with their political and analytical importance." And then Frances asks, "I wonder if that is because in part we've failed to historicize love that is so often overdetermined by a sort of Victorian sentimentality. So in that sense, I wonder if you could speak even further about how the colonial conditions of slavery shaped the interwoven love within the materials and stories that you discussed.
Wow, that is a multi-layered question, which I appreciate. I'm not quite sure where to begin with that, so I think I'll just enter in with a quote from Robin Kelly, which I think is beautiful and which I think is exactly right in terms of the ways in which we can limit ourselves with regard to our resources. And ourselves, by that, I mean anybody, everybody, I mean scholars in Black studies, any person interested in larger questions of humanity. We sometimes hide the very materials we need away from ourselves because we have devalued them. And love is challenging because it feels so amorphous. It does feel highly sentimentalized. That's what I experienced with this project. That's why it took me so long, way too long, to realize there's something here that actually has teeth. And that thing with teeth needs to be faced, and it needs to be considered, and we need to at least make an attempt to understand what it might have meant. I confess that I don't know. I can't get my hands or my mind around what that kind of love means, or what that kind of foresight could require to even think of bundling love up for your child in these sort of horrific circumstances. I can't quite get there, but I'm glad somebody got there. And the fact that Black women could get there, we have evidence of it, I think is helpful for us in our many different areas of life and in our many different endeavors in terms of facing the challenges that we confront. Another kind of channel of this question about love and freedom and their meanings in the present day, I think takes us squarely into Black studies. One of the points of feedback that I really took to heart that really shaped my further thinking of this object and of the story came from the fellows at the Hutchins Center at my home institution, who, after hearing a talk about this when it was more in a formative stage, pointed out that they think that Black studies as a field has shied away from love because of sort of a pressure to conform to the demands and definitions of the academy, which insist that we must be objective, whatever that means. And so these fellows actually were really important for my ability to see that I was orienting away from love, and for my decision to kind of veer back into that direction. The part of the question that asked about colonial history and materiality and how we can get at love at that intersection, it's a really interesting question. And it takes me to thoughts about what material culture and what artifacts can perhaps help us to access that we can't find in written materials. The embroidered sack is, of course, I mean, it's a written material, it's a document in a way, which is wonderful. But many items that we have, especially from Black culture in the colonial era, are not going to be written anything. They're not going to be, embroidered sacks, which doesn't even go back that far, of course. And they're not going to be documents. So what do we have? We have things. We may have, a broken button. We may have a piece of pottery. We may have a hole dug into the ground to hold and to save these objects. And then at that stage, when we see what we've got, I think we have to try to ask ourselves, what can we see or find in those remnant materials? And I think this is where the imagination kind of comes in, because when we find game pieces, for example, when we find spiritual artifacts, when we find buttons, when we find items that seem to have been held onto When we can then imagine a scene that could have played out around those artifacts, I think we can begin to see an emotional landscape. Because if there's a game piece, somebody was playing, if somebody was playing, they had a relationship, not just any relationship that would have had to incorporate probably teaching, give and take, care, cooperation, etc. So I think that's one way we get at these kind of nebulous, very difficult to reach aspects of the past, especially when it comes to marginalized groups, is through the things they left behind. And then by bringing to bear our imagination to try to think about, to try to picture how they might have used those things.
So maybe we'll keep going for one more moment with the role of the material. We have another question from James Neal from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, asking you to talk a little bit more about what you learned through this project about the role of material objects in historical research in relation to archives and specifically the context of South Carolina history.
One of the first things I learned is one cannot just start looking at and working with materials and think that she has the tools to understand those materials without training in those fields. Because I think that information may seem to be more overt when it comes to objects than it actually is. One of the things that I was really fortunate to be able to do was to spend time talking with curators of many different kinds of objects and to spend time with them with the objects, in the space of the objects, and just try to notice and ask questions about how they saw the objects and how it is that they handled those things. And one of the things that did for me was it helped me to think about the multi-sided aspects of the three-dimensional aspects of objects and materials, and about how those different dimensions can perhaps bear different kinds of uses and meanings. It helped me to think about the makeup of materials, which I'm certainly not expert at, but which I realized I need to try to get a better handle on to understand how things were made and how they might have been used. And that kind of an avenue, thinking about the makeup and production of materials, is also fruitful, I think, when it comes to interpretation. It's fruitful imaginatively because it opens up a whole kind of chain of construction or a chain of relationship with regard to those materials, which opens up a whole kind of landscape or cityscape or set of social relations. And all of that can be very handy, especially when the archival record is thin, which it certainly is in this case, and which it often is with regard to Black women's history, especially in these early periods, histories of enslaved people, and so on. So about Charleston, or was it South Carolina? Was the question was South Carolina?
South Carolina.
And materials. One thing that thinking about this sack led me to consider, not for the first time, but I think more intimately and more carefully, was the built environment and the broader kind of natural environment. Because the sack itself obviously comes from grown plants, and it comes from constructed and used and transformed plants, which had to be grown somewhere in a particular locality. And all that opens up environmental questions. And then as I tried to imagine Rose acquiring the sack, doing things with it physically, I had to imagine her in a cityscape. I had to try to think about how could she have gotten the sack? How could she have filled it? Where might she have kept it. And so that entry point into South Carolina as a place, into Charleston as a place, again, added dimension to my sense of that history. And it sort of drew my attention to corners of the history that I never would have really been looking at so closely before.
Well, thank you so much. I know we're at the end of our time and there are more questions that we all have for you, but I think I'll end with Don Camp's question because it's one that we all have, which is when will your book be published and where can we find it as soon as possible?
Thanks for that question. And thank you everybody for the comments in the chat. I really appreciate your feedback and your generosity with my dropping off of, just drop it off the screen for however many minutes that was.
We're all used to it.
My goodness, it reminds me of, was it the Muppet Show? Was it, who was the one who got the hook?
Yeah,
I remember that. So the book will be out on June 8th and it can be pre-ordered now and it's available for purchase in certainly at the big online places, but please try your local bookstore.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Miles. This is a wonderful talk and wonderful conversation and a great way to honor Stephanie Camp. And we really appreciate your engagement with her work and your engagement with all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jordana. Thanks, everyone.